This is the British Empire. This small island nation about the size of Michigan was over hundreds of years able to colonize the largest empire in history. This is China. For most of history, it was the most populated, richest, and one of the largest nations on Earth, and it colonized nothing. While the European nations colonized the far reaches of the world, China remained internally focused. This didn't have to happen. In the early years of the 15th century, China had the most powerful navy on Earth. Chinese fleets sailed all the way to Iran and East Africa. China placed garrisons in Sri Lanka and Malacca. This was under the reign of the Yongle Emperor, but after his death, all the expeditions and outward expansion stopped. Why did this happen? What could have allowed the Chinese to become a colonial empire? What would a world where that had happened look like? Those are the questions of this alternate history. The emperors of China shared power with the Confucian bureaucrats. The bureaucrats were supposed to amplify the emperor's power, but as bureaucrats often do, became a check upon the emperor and a force in their own right. The bureaucrats were a conservative and isolationist force, which was opposed to foreign expansion. Under his reign, the emperor was able through sheer personality to shove through his policies. However, upon his death, there was much to pick apart by the bureaucrats. The Yongle Emperor was engaged in a very bloody and lengthy attempt to conquer Vietnam, which was failing. His naval investments and expeditions outwards were also quite expensive, and so upon his death were terminated by the bureaucracy. China's brief fling with world expansion had ended, and the empire retreated into isolationism for several centuries. Of course, as is always the case in history, the reasons why something occurred, or more importantly, why it didn't occur, are complicated and steeped in even more history. It's hard for us in the West to understand China's historical mindset, simply because conditions were so different in each society. For almost all of history, China has been the dominant society in its region. The other surrounding states have been spokes around the wheel, adopting Chinese civilization, but never changing China itself. Every nation in the region, such as Burma, Japan, the Indonesian states, etc., paid some kind of homage at some point to the superiority of China. China as a single country, for almost all of history, has had as much population and economy as entire civilizations like Islam or Christendom. China in 1600 had a population of 150 million. All of Europe only had 100 million, and the Islamic world, not counting the Hindu majority Mughal possessions in India, combines at a population of 80 million. The first time China realized other nations existed besides China was 119 BC, and the first time China officially recognized another country as being independent was 1689, with Russia. The truth is that China was working off separate assumptions about the world and the European colonial powers. To figure out how a Chinese colonial empire would exist and function, we need to look at it through a Chinese lens, not a Western lens grafted onto China. The truth is that China under the Yongle Emperor was not a colonial empire in any way we would understand it in the Western world. In the West, the main purpose of setting out colonial expeditions was to bring some new area under the heel to conquer it. However, China had very little intention of conquering the areas it placed troops in. They merely existed to force the native population to admit the inherent superiority of China and maintain vassal privileges. China wished to establish its dominance throughout the region and receive tribute. There was no plan to place Chinese settlers in these areas and make them new Chinas in the same way we have New Englands and New Spains. These terms of vassalage meant very little, and China was clearly a great nation, so the nations of the Indian Ocean naturally obliged. However, this didn't really give the Chinese any reason to stay in the region, so they didn't. The main issue is that even if he tried to make a great colonial empire, the Yongle Emperor would be fighting against his dynasty. A few centuries earlier, the Mongols invaded China and killed somewhere above 30 million people. This was the third worst atrocity in history, just after World War II and Mao. They then ruled China under a cruel heel, but were eventually driven out. The Ming Dynasty was founded by a peasant boy who was able to make the most successful rebellion as the Mongol dynasty was collapsing into anarchy. After the massive death and foreign occupation, the Ming Dynasty was one of the most isolationist in all of Chinese history. You heard me right. Besides the Yongle Emperor, the Ming Dynasty almost never attacked outwards and controlled practically no land that wasn't majority Han Chinese. On one hand, this makes perfect sense. After what China had gone through, isolationism is a perfectly reasonable reaction. On the other hand, this isn't predestined. Later in history, when China was humiliated by the Western powers in Japan, it didn't turn in itself. It decided never to be humiliated again and became a global power. This is the sleeping dragon the Western nations awoke and must now be dealt with. We could have expected the Ming Dynasty to do something similar in this timeline hundreds of years earlier, using the humiliation and conquest as fodder for expansion. However, another issue is that the Ming Dynasty had major societal issues. In Europe, colonization was done almost entirely by the merchants and soldiers. You could very realistically make the argument that the government in London made almost none of the British Empire. However, in China, these forces were severely muzzled. There's a Chinese saying that roughly goes, in the same way you don't use good iron to make nails, you don't use good men to make soldiers. The Ming military was terribly equipped and trained across the board. Secondly, the merchants were kept down by various laws, social structures, and regulations that meant that capitalism never evolved in the same way as the West. These were both side effects of the strength of the central bureaucracy. The bureaucracy was scared of the merchants and soldiers and thus kept them down as societal forces. Since the bureaucrats were isolationist and conservative, China never had a colonial empire. In our world, China only became a world power when the Confucian bureaucrats were crushed by generations of Western technology and Marxism. So how do we change these two variables? We need new leadership. The Ming Dynasty goes through a complete overhaul in how they view the world. Or maybe the Ming Dynasty never exists at all, and some other peasant seizes power in Peking and founds a more capable dynasty. Having the military be more respected isn't difficult. The Manchus, being a warrior people themselves, when they took over China, treated the military with respect and paid it well, and lo and behold, the military quality increased enormously. What would make sense would be that the Ming Dynasty would make an alliance with the trading towns of China. China in this era experienced large economic growth and mercantilist expansion. The towns and middle class were rapidly expanding across China. If the emperors made a deal with this new force, it would create financial and trade reasons for expansion. This would create a balance of forces in the Chinese ruling regime between the military, merchants, emperor, and the bureaucrats that would help China dearly. In this timeline, after the Yongle Emperor's death, the ships and the navy are maintained out in the provinces. The colonies in the Indian Ocean would be far away, and so actually wouldn't be the main focus of the initial Chinese outwards colonization. China was surrounded by many semi-barbaric lands that would be perfect for colonization. In those days, Malaysia, Taiwan, the Philippines, New Guinea, and most of Indonesia were tribal. Malaysia and much of the Philippines would likely be early colonies, with the Chinese taking the strategic choke point at Malacca, or modern-day Singapore. China in this era was experiencing massive population growth. In 1500, China had a population of 125 million. In 1600, of 150 million, and in 1700, of 210 million. In our timeline, millions of Chinese migrated into Southeast Asia, and this would be even more true in this timeline. New Chinas would be created in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The states of Indonesia were Chinese tributaries and would remain that in this timeline. The Chinese, being the dominant naval power in this timeline, would actually start to exert serious influence over Indonesia. Indonesia was quite wealthy, with each group of islands producing a different expensive spice that was exported to the rest of the world. Like the Dutch who colonized Indonesia in our timeline, the Chinese would build trading forts in strategic locations throughout the archipelago, especially Java, the fertile, civilized island with more than half the population. The local Indonesian states were very militarily primitive, meaning that just like the Dutch, the Chinese would expand their force into a hegemony dominating all of Indonesia. The 15th century would be spent consolidating control over Southeast Asia. Japanese pirates dominated the northern coast of China. Even at the height of the Chinese Navy's power, trade along the northern coast of China was physically impossible due to this, and the Chinese Navy several times narrowly escaped destruction by Japanese pirates in its capital port of Nanjing. This means a Chinese discovery of America, which would use China's eastern instead of southern ports, is quite unlikely at this stage. Meanwhile, at the turn of the 16th century, we would start to see the arrival of Europeans, mainly the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean. The Chinese at this stage, based out of their port at Malacca, would have garrisons spread around the Indian Ocean, demanding tribute from the native states, but with the main Chinese focus being in Southeast Asia. The Europeans would bring new deadly technology with them. A lot's been made of how the Chinese ships of the Yongle Emperor's era were massive and super advanced, and that's true, but the Western ships of that era were much more militarily advanced. Western ships put cannons on wheels, meaning the recoil would not destroy the ships. This in turn meant that Western ships had far more firepower than Asian ones, and this is why Western ships were able to dominate the world's oceans. Chinese ships, meanwhile, used ranged warfare like the West, but mainly concentrated with bows and arrows and fire lances, or primitive flamethrowers. The Western cannons would initially dislodge Chinese ships from the Indian Ocean. However, in this timeline, China would do something it only rarely did in our one. adapt to European technology. The China of this timeline would have strong military and colonial influences that would find it necessary to adapt to European weapon styles. This would mean that China in this timeline would be able to maintain military technological parity with the West. The Indian Ocean is weirdly divided in that the monsoon blows one way half the year and the other way the other half, and different parts of the ocean have completely different wind and oceanic patterns. This means that the ocean is effectively divided at Sri Lanka, with eastern and western halves. The Europeans would come to dominate the western half, while the Chinese the eastern. The Chinese control over Indonesia and the surrounding waters would mean that they would likely discover, and being the only force in the region, colonize Australia. While China would be facing great successes in the south, it would be facing great troubles in the north. I've already talked of the Japanese pirates that ravaged the northern and eastern coasts of China. Meanwhile, right after the Yongle Emperor in our timeline, the Ming Dynasty faced an incredibly humiliating defeat by the Mongols that almost wiped out the central government. With a more militarily competent Ming Dynasty, this is much less likely to happen. However, with the Mongols in the north, the Chinese would be incapable of expanding north and west. Meanwhile, the Chinese, being a strong naval power, would try to drive the Japanese pirates off the eastern seas. This would actually horrifically backfire. The Chinese usage of Western boat styles would result in the Japanese joining into the massive European-Chinese arms race. In our timeline, the Japanese adopted European technologies much better than the Chinese in the 16th century, meaning this wouldn't be an issue in this timeline. In our timeline, since China was an isolationist country, after Japan failed in its invasion of Korea, Japan became an isolationist country, turning its back on the world. However, with China being a massive naval power that could threaten Japan itself, this would become impossible. Japan would instead double down and try its best to rival China, becoming a military and colonial power. The East Asian arms race creates interesting side effects. With massive naval warfare circling around Korea, it's highly probable that the Korean turtle boat, or the first ironclads invented in the 16th century, would become widely used in the Chinese and Japanese navies. Meanwhile, since the Chinese would be fighting the Europeans in the Indian Ocean, we could have seen turtle boats become staples of naval battles in 17th century Europe. Also, with the escalation between Japan and China, Korea could have become a colonial and military competitor. However, I put the chances as less likely than likely for this. The East Asians would first hear about America from the Europeans, and the Spanish would find a way to organize trade between their colonies in Mexico and the Chinese colonies in the Philippines, like they did in our timeline. The Japanese, to compete with the Chinese, would create a colony in America. Meanwhile, the Chinese, to prevent the Japanese from seizing the continent, would also found a colony, kind of like the English and the French on the other side of the continent. The Chinese, being a more southerly and more powerful nation, would seize the southern and better port of San Francisco. Meanwhile, the Japanese would seize the northern and second best port of Seattle. We would see the Chinese colony develop out of California and the Japanese one out of the Pacific Northwest. The Japanese would follow the Kuroshima Current to reach their colonies in the Pacific Northwest. Thus, the Japanese would colonize the coast of Siberia and some actually kind of temperate areas like Kamchatka and Primorye alongside Alaska. In our timeline, the Manchurian tribes came out of the north and conquered China in 1644. This seems unlikely in this timeline. Firstly, the Ming Dynasty had been in decline for 200 years beforehand, and the Manchus were able to exploit all the internal issues with the Ming that we got rid of earlier in this video. Also, the Manchus were able to exploit European technologies much better than the Chinese were, which wouldn't be the case in this timeline. In Europe in the 17th century, the combination of gunpowder and drilled formation allowed mainly the Russians to smash the horse tribes of the grasslands. This would not be the case in this timeline in China. The Manchus weren't entirely nomadic, with a strong farming base, and were able to adapt to European technology very well. The mini-ice age was brutal to Manchuria, meaning that to survive, they basically had to invade south into China. This would result in a nasty war, which, unlike our timeline, would result in the Chinese winning instead of getting conquered by the Manchus. However, the Manchus would maintain their coalition with the Mongols and would remain a thorn in China's northern side. This would prevent China from expanding north in this timeline. Meanwhile, as the Russians would expand east across Siberia and Central Asia, the Manchus would come to rival them. The Manchus would be able to build a coalition of steppe tribes against the Russians and control the eastern half of the Eurasian steppe, alongside Siberia. The Manchurians would be sandwiched between three populated powerful nations, Japan, China, and Russia. After around 100 years of regional dominance, the Manchurians would likely be conquered by the Russians and the Chinese, as gunpowder would continue to erode the nomadic horsemen's advantage, and as Russians would migrate east, the Manchus would be crushed. The Japanese, with their colonies along the eastern coast of Siberia, would do very well, carving up much of Siberia in the confusion. In the end, Siberia would likely be partitioned something along these lines. The Ming Dynasty would still likely fall. A single family can only dominate a country for so long. However, the next dynasty that would replace them would be ethnically Han and continue their expansion and policies. In our timeline, the two main competitors for the colonization of India were the British and the French. These two came to dominance because they were able to exploit the relatively untapped trade of eastern India, while western India was already dominated by a series of smaller nations like the Dutch, Danes, or Portuguese. However, with the Chinese being the main trade power in eastern India, both forces would cancel each other out. The Chinese would intervene against any European attempt to colonize the subcontinent and vice versa. In this way, India would remain independent. One of two things could have happened if the British never colonized India. Firstly, the Maratha hill tribes could have carved out their own empire in the north of India, or the Afghan tribes could have carved out their own empire in the north of India. Either way, the state would likely be filled with Europeans and Chinese jockeying for influence. This would probably end up like the Ottoman Empire, which survived by playing the European powers against each other for the balance of power. The north of India would probably be a large empire, while the south would be a mix of smaller states. In North America, we would likely see the Japanese, Chinese, and Anglos divide up the continent. The Asians and Europeans would likely eventually have the Rocky Mountains as their main barrier. I'm not sure if Mexico could survive as a minor power, let's say keeping New Mexico and southern Texas, by playing off the Chinese and the Anglos. Maybe some analog of the Confederacy could split off with Chinese cooperation to weaken the Central American state. China would industrialize in this timeline. China just industrialized in our world, meaning it can be done. In our world, overpopulation made industrialization less feasible in China because why buy advanced equipment if you can just hire 20 cheap guys to do it? With a massive colonial empire exporting population, this would be much less the case. With a much weaker Confucian bureaucracy, much stronger towns and merchants, alongside adding in all sorts of resources from the colonies and military technological competition with Europe, we practically have a perfect recipe for industrialization in the 19th century. In this timeline, China would today be an established massive industrial superpower with hundreds of years of history behind it. What if Altist? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please comment, subscribe, support me on Patreon, and stay tuned for future videos. And as always, thank you for your time.